Go on up to the wall of Uruk and walk around. So begins one of the oldest surviving works of literature. The poet does not begin with a battle or a god or even the great king Gilgamesh. He directs the reader towards the city itself, to look at its foundations, he says, and to examine its brickwork, to walk the length of its walls. Gilgamesh had crossed mountains and killed monsters and traveled beyond the edge of the known world in search of eternal life. He would ultimately fail, but Uruk would remain. The city was his answer to death. By the time the Epic of Gilgamesh reached its surviving form, Uruk was already unimaginably ancient. Its walls had been rebuilt and its temples altered and its gods renamed and its earliest inhabitants forgotten. The city had existed for longer than the entire span separating us from the Roman Empire. But there was a time when none of it had existed at all. A time when there had been no walls and no tablets and no scribes recording grain or monumental temples rising from the plain. There had only been scattered communities living besides the changing channels of the Euphrates. And then, during the 4th millennium BCE, something happened in southern Mesopotamia. People gathered in numbers never before seen. Labor became organized on an unprecedented scale. Farmers supported potters and builders and metalworkers and priests and administrators and scribes. Goods moved across hundreds of miles. Vast institutions would begin to count fields and animals and workers and jars of grain. And from these changes would emerge Uruk. It wasn't humanity's first permanent settlement. It was not the first place to ever construct any walls or temples or really monumental buildings, and it may not even have been the only place in which early urban life developed. In northern Mesopotamia, Tel Brak had already reached substantial proportions during the early 4th millennium BCE, complicating any simple claim that civilization was invented in one place on one particular day. But Uruk was different. Its scale was unprecedented. Its population was divided into increasingly specialized roles. Its monumental districts were seemingly planned, rebuilt, and enlarged across generations, and its administration produced the earliest substantial body of written records known to us. Uruk was not merely a large village, it was one of the strongest candidates for being the first true city in human history. And with the city came nearly everything that urban civilization would make possible, and also nearly everything that it would demand in return. This story did not begin in Sumer. Thousands of years before Uruk would rise, communities across the Fertile Crescent had already begun domesticating plants and animals. At this time, in the Levant, Anatolia, and northern Mesopotamia, hunting and gathering would gradually give way to more permanent settlements, which were sustained by wheat and barley and lentils and sheep, goats, and cattle. Some of these settlements would become remarkably large. Jericho would possess walls and a stone tower long before these other first cities. Aşıklı Höyük in Anatolia may have housed several thousand people within a dense mass of adjoining buildings. Other ritual centers, such as Göbekli Tepe, would demonstrate that organized communities could mobilize substantial labor forces even before agriculture had really fully transformed the human society. Yet size alone did not make a city. The houses at many of these earlier settlements were broadly very similar. Most families remained directly involved in producing food in some way. There was comparatively little separation between distinct administrative or ceremonial, industrial, and residential districts. Although status differences certainly existed, there was nothing really comparable to the vast bureaucratic institutions that would later appear at Uruk. The developments that eventually produced those institutions unfolded gradually across Mesopotamia. During the 7th and 6th millennium BCE, the Hassuna, Samarra, and Halaf cultures would occupy parts of northern and central Mesopotamia. Their inhabitants would cultivate cereals and raise livestock, manufactured elaborately painted pottery, and would exchange materials across considerable distances. Samarran communities would also experiment with early forms of irrigation, carrying water into areas where rainfall alone could not support any dependable agriculture. And farther south still, another tradition emerged during the 6th and 5th millennium BCE, the Ubaid culture. The Ubaid world would stretch across southern Mesopotamia and eventually influence communities from the Persian Gulf to northern Syria. Its settlements were generally modest, but they contained many of the elements from which later urban civilization would develop. irrigation, long-distance exchange and trade, increasingly differentiated households, and prominent central buildings that were repeatedly enlarged. At Eridu, close to the ancient marshlands, generations rebuilt a sanctuary on the same site. What began as a relatively small mud-brick room eventually rose upon a succession of platforms. Long afterwards, Sumerian tradition remembered Eridu as the place where kingship had first descended from heaven itself. The Sumerian king list claims that its earliest rulers reigned for tens of thousands of years. That's more mythology than chronology, but the tradition preserved something more meaningful. Even to the inhabitants of ancient Mesopotamia, Eridu seemed to belong to the beginning of the world. Uruk would grow from the same Ubaid foundation. It didn't suddenly appear out of nowhere, and there's no clear archaeological boundary separating a supposedly foreign Sumerian people from those who had lived on the plain before them. The older theory that civilization arrived fully formed with an invading population is no longer as persuasive. The transition seems overwhelmingly local, even if migration and cultural mixtures undoubtedly formed some parts of it. Southern Mesopotamia is often imagined as a naturally fertile garden between the Tigris and Euphrates. And that description is only partly true. The alluvial soil deposited by the rivers was extraordinarily productive, but the region received very little dependable rainfall. The rivers could sometimes flood violently, or change course, or just full-on abandon old channels. Their highest waters arrived at a dangerous point in the agricultural year, when crops were still growing, and away from the rivers and marshes, the land could become suddenly dry and very unforgiving. While the landscape offered abundance, it was only when it was carefully managed. Canals would move water towards fields and settlements, and ditches would drain excess water away. Embankments would separate cultivated ground from wetlands, and agricultural labor had to be coordinated over areas far larger than a single household could easily control. This didn't mean that irrigation automatically created kings or a despotic government. Small communities had managed water collectively for centuries. But as the cultivated area expanded, so did the need to coordinate the planting and the harvesting, the storage of grains and the canal maintenance and the distribution of labor. Barley became especially important. It tolerates the increasingly saline soil better than wheat and could be consumed as either bread or porridge or even beer. Sheep would convert marginal pasture into wool and milk and meat, and fish and other waterfowls and reeds would come from the marshes. Clay was available almost everywhere. Other essential materials, however, were pretty much absent. Southern Mesopotamia possessed little useful stone and no great forests of construction-worthy timber, and really no significant local deposits of copper, silver, or gold, even though Ian the Seer would have you believe otherwise. The same landscape that could sustain an enormous population could not supply everything that an increasingly stratified society would ever consider necessary. Uruk's rise therefore depended upon two systems at once. One would draw water across the plain, and the other would draw resources across the ancient Near East. During the early 4th millennium BCE, the settlement at Uruk began expanding rapidly. The chronology is difficult, and estimates vary according to how archaeologists define the occupied area. Uruk may already have covered around 70 hectares early in the millennium, and by its later phases, the inhabited and monumental zones appear to have extended across roughly 250 hectares, perhaps more. In the early 3rd millennium, the greater urban area may have approached 400 hectares. Population estimates are even less certain. There's numbers ranging from approximately 25,000 to more than 50,000, while higher figures depend upon more assumptions about housing density and how much of the surveyed area was actually occupied at any one given time in history. The precise number itself matters less so than the scale of the transformation. A person born in a village of several hundred people could now enter a settlement containing tens of thousands. Beyond the city would lay fields and orchards, grazing land, and a hierarchy of smaller communities. Canals would converge upon the urban center carrying food and reeds, livestock, and also people. Inside of Uruk itself, the settlement appears to have developed around two major ceremonial districts. To the west stood the precinct later associated with Anu, the sky god, and with the old settlement of Kulab, and there successive buildings were constructed upon an enormous elevated terrace. The best known is the so-called White Temple. whose plastered exterior would have caught the sunlight above the flat plain. The temple itself was not a ziggurat in the later, fully developed sense associated with cities such as Ur, but its elevated platform belonged to the architectural tradition from which later ziggurats would actually develop. Anyone approaching Uruk by canal or across open fields would have seen it from a considerable distance. The second great precinct was Iana, the House of Heaven. This district was associated with Inanna, the principal goddess of Uruk. It contained a succession of monumental halls and courtyards and terraces and workshops and administrative spaces, and many were demolished and rebuilt within relatively short periods, suggesting that institutions were capable of mobilizing immense numbers of laborers. Their walls were decorated with thousands of small clay or stone cones, their colored ends pressed into plaster to create geometric mosaics. Limestone and bitumen and other materials were carried into a region where ordinary construction relied overwhelmingly upon mud bricks. And these were not merely large houses, but they were buildings designed to overwhelm the viewer. Their scale separated the institutions that they housed from the ordinary dwellings around them. Their unusual materials would display the ability to command distant resources. Their repeated reconstruction demonstrated that whoever controlled Uruk could summon labor beyond the capacity of any individual family. The city had developed a monumental center because it had developed power capable of actually building one. One object from the Eanna precinct captures this new order more clearly than any surviving text really can. The Warka vase stands around a meter tall. Carved into its surface is a procession arranged in horizontal registers. At the bottom we see water and cultivated plants, which are the foundations of life on the Mesopotamian plain. Above them we see sheep and other animals moving, and above the animals walk naked men carrying vessels and baskets presumably filled with produce. At the highest surviving level, a richly dressed figure approaches a female personage or representative standing before the symbols of Inanna. Behind them are offerings and containers and sacred objects. Everything rises from the water towards this goddess. The vase presents society as a hierarchy. The natural world produces plants. Plants and water sustain animals. Human labor gathers the surplus. An elite figure presents that surplus to the divine household. It may depict some particular ceremony, but it's also an argument about how the world should work. Agriculture, labor, political authority, and divine favor are shown to be parts of a single ordered system. The ruler-like figure is sometimes called a priest-king. Similar bearded figures appear in Uruk period imagery, hunting animals and defeating enemies or approaching divine symbols. But we don't know his title, or whether he even represents one office or several, or whether authority at Uruk was even concentrated in a single ruler. The image tells us, though, that an elite of some sort existed, but it doesn't tell us precisely how that elite governed. For the ordinary inhabitants of Uruk, the urban revolution was probably a lot less magnificent than you might imagine. A city of this size could not exist unless thousands of people surrendered part of what they produced. Grain had to be collected by officials and measured and stored, and herds had to be counted, and workers had to be assigned to building projects or canals and workshops and fields. The institutions operating out of Uruk's monumental districts appear to have functioned as sort of enormous households, if you will. They individually possessed lands and animals and storage facilities and also had dependent workers. Their exact relationships to what we would call temples or palaces or a kind of government remains disputed still, partly because those modern categories may not actually fit neatly into 4th millennium Mesopotamia. Religion was seemingly not a separate department of life. The city belonged in principle to its god or to its goddess. Goods would be delivered to the divine household, which could sustain the priests and the administrators and the craftspeople and laborers attached to that god. Offerings to Inanna were also part of Uruk's political economy. Among the most common objects found across the Uruk world are crude clay vessels known as beveled rim bowls. They were produced quickly in standardized forms, apparently using molds. Unlike the elaborately painted pottery of earlier cultures, they were simply plain and likely very repetitive. Tens of thousands have been recovered, and their purpose still remains debated. Many archaeologists interpret them as containers for standard food rations issued to workers or craftspeople, and others have proposed uses connected with bread making or dairy production or salt or offerings. Now, whatever their precise functions, they belong to a new world of mass production. An object didn't have to be unique or beautiful, it just had to be made quickly, and it had to be made consistently, and also in enormous numbers. That same principle also extends to human labor. A worker individually could be counted and assigned and provisioned as part of an institution larger than any one individual or a village. Urban life offers security and communal storage and divine protection and access to specialized goods, but it may also have meant compulsory labor and dependence on the state and the permanent presence of authorities capable of recording what was owed. The first city was an achievement of itself, but it was also a demand. As Uruk would continue to grow, memory and oral traditions was no longer enough. An administrator might need to know how much barley had entered a particular storehouse, or how many sheep belonged to a particular institution, or which workers had already received rations, or what quantity of land had been assigned for cultivation. For generations, communities had used these small clay tokens to represent commodities and quantities. Some were enclosed inside clay envelopes known as boule, and marks impressed upon the exterior indicated what had been sealed within. Gradually, the impression would actually replace the object. Numerical signs and pictures were pressed or drawn directly into clay tablets. A head combined with a vessel could represent either eating or a ration. Different numerical systems were used for grain and animals and land and also time. By approximately 3400 to 3200 BCE, tablets from Uruk contain what is generally called proto-cuneiform. This wasn't yet literature in the modern sense, but it was also not used to record speeches or battles or personal reflections or any kind of human thought and emotion. The signs were not even consistently attached to the grammar of any spoken language. They just conveyed categories and commodities as well as quantities and administrative relationships. The first substantial written archive in history is therefore largely silent about what its creators thought and felt. It tells us only what they counted. Most surviving tablets concern some form of economic administration, and a smaller but significant group consists of lexical lists. These are ordered collections of animals or vessels, places and materials and professions. One of the most important, called the Standard Professions List, arranged occupational titles in a form of hierarchy and was copied in Mesopotamian scribal education for centuries. The system did more than just record the city, it helped to organize it, and writing allowed authorities to preserve information beyond the memory of any particular one official. It allowed categories and obligations to survive the death of the people who had first agreed to them and written them down. A seal impression would identify an individual or a household or an office, and a tablet could then be stored, retrieved, and checked again in the future. And the city had become too large to know itself face to face. It now only knew itself largely through records. At the very center of Uruk stood Inanna. Her sign appears among the earliest written documents, and Inanna remained one of Mesopotamia's great sanctuaries for thousands of years. In later Sumerian and Akkadian literature, Inanna, or Ishtar, became one of the most complex gods of the ancient world. She was associated with sexual desire, with fertility and warfare, and royal authority, and the planet of Venus. She could bestow power and take it away. She would cross boundaries between order and violence, and masculinity and femininity, and heaven and the underworld. But caution here is very necessary. Most of the literature describing this elaborate personality comes from the 3rd and 2nd millennium BCE, long after Uruk's initial transformation. We shouldn't assume that the inhabitants of the 4th millennium city would understand every aspect of Inanna exactly as the later scribes did. What we can say is that her sanctuary would occupy a central position in the city, and that her symbols appear at the summit of Uruk's ceremonial imagery. Inanna was bound to the identity of the city itself. Later rulers would claim to have her support, and poets would make her the source of victory and desire and kingship. In the stories of Uruk's heroic dynasty, she would send kings into the mountains, demand foreign riches, and help determine who may rule the city. There is no sound evidence for the popular claim that Uruk's temples operated organized systems of universal sacred prostitution, quote unquote. Mesopotamian literature certainly linked sexuality and fertility and divine power, and some cultic personnel probably occupied some sexual or gendered roles that later societies would find too difficult to classify. But this was a far more complicated religious world than the old stereotype of temple prostitution would ever suggest. Uruk could produce immense quantities of grain, wool, textiles, fish, leather, and general agricultural goods. But its elites wanted copper, it wanted silver, it especially wanted gold, and it also needed timber and stone. Those resources lay far beyond the alluvial plain. Timber would come from the upland regions, and copper could be obtained from Iran and Anatolia and other lands around the Gulf. Fine stone and obsidian and metals would pass through networks stretching across the Sakros Mountains and along the Euphrates. The stories would later tell about Uruk repeatedly looking towards these resource-rich margins. In Enmerkar and the Lord of Arada, the ruler of Uruk demands precious materials from a distant mountain kingdom, so that Inanna's sanctuary may be adorned. In the Gilgamesh tradition, the king and Enkidu travel to the cedar forest and kill its guardian. The heroic story transforms economic necessity into myth. A king of the treeless plain journeys into dangerous foreign lands and returns with timber. Archaeology reveals the same outward movement without the monsters. During the later 4th millennium BCE, settlements containing southern Mesopotamian architecture and pottery and seals and administrative practices would appear across an enormous area. Some, such as Habuba Kabira and Jebel Aruda on the Euphrates, appear to have been planned communities established by people already very closely connected with the southern Uruk world. Their buildings and pottery, as well as their administrative devices, would strongly resemble those of the Mesopotamian lowlands. Other sites present a more complicated picture, though. At Susa in southwestern Iran, Tel Brak in the north, and in the communities across Anatolia and the rest of the Iranian plateau, local traditions continued alongside the imported Uruk objects and practices. These weren't empty lands awaiting civilizations. They contained communities with their own elites and economies and histories. Guillermo Algazi has described this network as the earliest known world system, an unequal web of exchange connecting the resource-rich highlands with the agriculturally productive and administratively advanced cities of the south. He's also argued that some Uruk enclaves may represent an early form of an informal empire, or really even humanity's first imperial venture. The model is influential, but it remains hotly debated. We do not know whether one government in Uruk would direct the entire network, and we don't know whether different southern cities would compete with one another, or whether merchants acted independently, or really how much influence would belong to these potentially local rulers. Some communities may have welcomed the exchange, and others may have resisted it. Uruk-style pottery doesn't automatically prove political conquest. The safest conclusion is still remarkable, however. By the late 4th millennium BCE, communities that are separated by a vast distance were participating in a system of settlement and production and exchange and administration centered to a significant degree upon southern Mesopotamia. Uruk at this point had become more than a city, it had become the center of a world. The people who inhabited Uruk are usually called Sumerians. While they didn't use that name for themselves in precisely the same way, the southern country was known to them as Kingir, and later Akkadian texts would use a form to describe them that became our word of Sumer. Now, Sumer was not a unified kingdom or nation-state, it was rather a landscape of cities consisting of Uruk and Ur and Eridu, Lagash, Umma, Nippur, Shuruppak, and many others. Each would possess its own institutions and its own territory and its own unique patron gods. While they shared religious traditions and administrative practices, they also had a recognizable urban culture. But at the same time, they also fought bitterly over land and canals and over political supremacy. Their language, Sumerian, is a linguistic isolate. It has no demonstrated relationship to any other surviving language. But southern Mesopotamia was never actually culturally or linguistically pure. Semitic languages ancestral to Akkadian were also spoken in the region. Sumerian and Akkadian names appear beside one another once writing actually becomes capable of recording language more clearly. The populations of the plain were probably the result of continuous movement and mixture and settlement. To the east would lay Elam and the cities of the Iranian lowlands, including Susa. To the north were the communities of Upper Mesopotamia, including Tel Brak and Nineveh. Farther west still would lay the towns of Syria and the routes toward the Mediterranean. Across the Gulf were maritime connections that would later link Mesopotamia with Dilmun, Magan, and eventually the Indus world. Uruk did not create all of these societies, but it became one participant, albeit an extraordinarily powerful one, in a much older network of interaction already in place. The institutions first visible at Uruk would survive through its period of dominance, and during the 3rd millennium BCE, the Sumerian cities would all compete for supremacy. Kingship became more explicitly and outwardly military. Palaces would grow besides temples, and written records expanded from accounting into royal inscriptions and treaties and legal decisions, and also hymns and stories. Around the 24th century BCE, Lugosagizi of Uruk would conquer much of Sumer. His achievement was soon eclipsed by Sargon of Akkad, who defeated him and created the first durable territorial empire in Mesopotamian history. Sargon's state would unite regions commonly described as Sumer and Akkad. His successors would campaign from the Persian Gulf towards the Mediterranean and into the mountains of Iran. After the Akkadian Empire's collapse, southern kings would eventually re-establish central control under the 3rd dynasty of Ur. Babylon and Assyria would later inherit this world. It would take its gods and its scribal traditions, its legal concepts and its royal ideology, and the belief that civilization was something rooted in cities of immemorial age. Behind them all stood Uruk. Around the end of the 4th millennium BCE, the Uruk expansion came apart. Southern-style settlements along the Euphrates were seemingly abandoned. Uruk influence receded from parts of northern Mesopotamia and from the Iranian plateau. At Susa, the local elites developed a separate administrative tradition now called Proto-Elamite. Uruk itself would undergo substantial reorganization. Monumental buildings within the Yana district were demolished and leveled or just completely replaced. The Anu precinct was transformed by new construction. Beveled rim bowls gradually disappeared and new ceramic traditions emerged. The reasons remain completely uncertain at this point. Climate change and increasing aridity may have placed pressure on the agricultural systems, and river channels may have shifted, trade routes may have changed. The growing complexity of local societies in the north and the east may have weakened the southern control, or political authority within the Uruk world may simply have fragmented. There's not a single sufficient explanation. But the end of the Uruk system was not the end of urban civilization. While its former colonies disappeared, many local centers would continue. On the southern plain, several cities now competed, rather than just accepting the dominance of one. The world system that Uruk had built up until this point would collapse, but the city itself would survive. It's only after the great urban transformation that individual personalities begin to emerge out of the darkness, and even then they appear first through legends. The Sumerian king list names Enmerkar, Logobanda, Dumuzi, and Gilgamesh among the early kings of Uruk. It assigns some of them some impossibly long reigns, and arranges dynasties that must, in reality, really have overlapped. Gilgamesh may have actually been a historical ruler around the beginning of the 3rd millennium BCE. A figure bearing his name was worshipped as a deified king by the mid-3rd millennium, and another ruler appearing in the Gilgamesh stories, Aga of Kish, probably also has a historical foundation. But no contemporary royal inscription proves that Gilgamesh built Uruk's walls or fought Humbaba or really went on a large and grand quest for immortality. The surviving Sumerian poems about him were composed centuries after his supposed lifetime. The unified Akkadian epic emerged later still and would continue to be copied and revised for more than 1,000 years. These are not eyewitness or contemporary accounts, but they're cultural memories, and those memories repeatedly will connect Uruk with the origins of civilization as we know it. Enmerkar, an earlier legendary king, is credited with founding relations between Uruk and the distant land of Aratta. When his messenger can no longer remember his speech, the poem describes the king pressing words into clay. The Lord of Kulaba patted some clay and wrote the message as if on a tablet. This story does not accurately record the historical invention of writing, and the poem was written long after Proto-Cuneiform had actually appeared. But later Sumerians would look back towards the heroic kings of Uruk when they imagined how writing had begun. Lugalbanda travels through mountain lands and gains the favor of the gods. Gilgamesh journeys to the cedar forest and returns with precious timber. Inanna demands that the wealth of distant regions be brought to her sanctuary. These legends preserve a distorted reflection of the world that archaeology has uncovered. A wealthy city on a very resource-poor plain depended upon routes reaching into foreign mountains. In the epic, Gilgamesh begins as a king without restraint. His strength oppresses the people of Uruk. The gods create Enkidu as his equal. After their confrontation, the two would become companions and set out in search of fame. They would kill Humbaba in the cedar forest, and they would defeat the bull of heaven. But victory brings punishment. Enkidu dies, and Gilgamesh discovers that physical strength cannot protect him from grief. He abandons Uruk and wanders through the wilderness. He crosses mountains and waters and finds Utnapishtim, a survivor of the ancient flood, and asks how a human being might escape death. Gilgamesh is offered tests and fails them. He's offered a plant that might restore youth, but it's taken from him by a snake. Gilgamesh returns with nothing. No immortality, no miraculous object, and no answer that can preserve his body forever. Then the poem brings him back to Uruk. It returns to the wall. The same king who had searched beyond the human world is forced to recognize that meaning lies within it. He may die, but the bricks shaped under his rule may endure yet. His name will be remembered because it has become attached to the city and preserved upon clay tablets. The historical Gilgamesh, if he ever existed, did not build Uruk from nothing. The city was probably already ancient before his supposed lifetime. Its temples and administration and written traditions have been created by countless of people whose names are now forever lost. Which may be the final irony of the Gilgamesh epic. Gilgamesh seeks immortality as an individual. What survives is a collective achievement. Uruk would remain inhabited through the rise and fall of several kingdoms and empires. It would be ruled by Sumerian dynasties and Akkadian conquerors and the kings of Ur. Its sanctuaries were restored by later Babylonians and Kassites. Under the Seleucid Persians, more than 3,000 years after the city first expanded, scholars at Uruk were still copying religious texts and studying the movements of the heavens. Eventually, the Euphrates would shift away. Political centers would move elsewhere. The old sanctuaries lost their wealth and communities would gradually abandon the site. By the late antiquity, the city that had helped create urban life had really just become a field of eroding mud-brick mounds. Yet the systems pioneered there would not just disappear. The city itself allowed populations to become larger and more specialized and more productive than before. It would make monumental architecture, it would organize scholarship and complex trade, and it preserved knowledge beyond the lifespan of any one individual. It would also concentrate wealth and authority. It would divide people by their occupation and their status, and it would make taxation, military conscription, bureaucracy, and organized warfare possible on an entirely new scale. At Uruk, people discovered that thousands of strangers could live within one economic and political community. They also discovered that those strangers could be counted and utilized by a unified state. The origins of the city cannot be reduced to one invention, or one ruler, or one sudden revolution. Uruk was the product of millennia of farming and migration and exchange and religious practices and collective labor. Its inhabitants would draw upon the achievement of communities that came before them, and its rise took place alongside other experiments in urban life throughout Mesopotamia. But at Uruk, those elements would come together with an unprecedented force. The fields would sustain the workers would raise the temples would gather the surplus, the administrators would count it, and the scribes would press those numbers into clay. While Gilgamesh failed to overcome death, Uruk did not. Its walls fell and its canals dried, and the names of almost all of its people would disappear. But the ideas that were created there, with the city as an organized world of its own, would pass from Sumer to Akkad to Babylon and to Assyria and to countless other civilizations that followed. 6,000 years on, most of humanity still lives inside of that idea. Gilgamesh, the king, died, but the city became immortal. As always, thank you very much for watching. I really appreciate it. I welcome any and all comments, whether good or bad, and I definitely appreciate a subscription if you enjoyed any of my videos. There is definitely plenty more to come. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next one.